During the 1972 Munich Olympics, an American sports broadcasting crew finds itself thrust into covering the hostage crisis involving Israeli athletes. September 5 is directed by Tim Fehlbaum and stars Peter Sarsgaard, John Magaro, Leonie Benesch, and many more. So Jeffrey, what did you think about September 5?
September 5 reminds me a lot of like the lean and mean thrillers of the 1970s, kind of like All the President's Men. You barely get any character development and you kind of barely get any context to what's going on. You simply get this group of morally righteous individuals who will stop at nothing to get the right story, and the plot and tension is really what moves the film forward. To me, it's a film that's extremely well researched and very, very well orchestrated. There's a lot of footage here that's being used from ABC's pretty extensive archive of this event, and you even get some intersections of real-life people, such as Peter Jennings, that make appearances. September 5 feels like very exciting, but maybe somewhat slight to me. It's definitely a film that breezes by on the intensity of its events and the propulsive quality that the film has. It's interesting because for the most part, we know how the story is going to end, but a lot of what's interesting about the film is figuring out how the people in the film will figure out how the story's going to end. It's almost like them putting the pieces together is some of what's so interesting about it. Those pieces of textual elements kind of make the full story. I really enjoyed watching the film, and I feel like it has this old school sensibility that I talked about before that I really wish was more present in films today. But at the same time, it feels kind of slight in terms of its ambition, in terms of the questions that it's asking. I was pretty surprised when I sat down to write some notes and organize my thoughts for this review, how little I actually remembered of the film, which is kind of interesting and I think somewhat telling. So I had to refresh myself somewhat, and I do feel like that's indicative of the film's overall power, which is that it's very propulsive and intense to watch when you're watching it, but at the same time, its lasting power may feel lacking.
I completely agree. I do want to make the point that I was not actually aware of these events in history, this historical event. So I had no idea of anything about this. I have not seen Munich yet, and that was the film you told me actually deals directly with this tragedy. But what I will say is one of the things I did like about the film is the different viewpoint in which this tragedy is being seen. It feels personal in almost a different way because it's people that are present at the conflict, but they're also the same people that are responsible for showing the world what is happening. And the thing I probably liked the most about the film was this dissection of the mechanics of how to tell this story to the public. And I found that to be, I would say, the most gripping part of the movie, how we get this audio and this footage as close as we can to these events. How can we rig this camera to get a view of this apartment window? How is communication used between all these moving pieces during a time where we only had these landlines and walkie-talkies? So I liked that the movie was almost like this period piece. It felt very gritty. I liked the cinematography on it. It had so much texture in the picture and the image. So I really liked those aspects of the film. But I do agree with you. I do think the film is a bit slight, and I do have some more things that I will discuss on that as we progress in this review.
I think you're right that a lot of the details of the film are some of the most interesting parts. So like one of my favorite parts of the film is this little detail about how they're trying to get more film across the barricade.
Yeah.
So they have to fabricate this ID for an athlete, like to get one of their team members to be masquerading as an athlete. And it gives you like a rather authentic behind the scenes view of an unfolding crisis like this. And I really appreciate the steady hand it has with some of the thoughts and the details there. This film takes place in the analog age. It takes place in a very different age than we are now. So kind of like when I saw Zodiac back in the day, I was like, okay, so this is how they used to do detective work before there was computers. You had to call around and you had to look up newspapers. In the same way, it was really interesting to see news reporting in that age and how is that making its way to the screen in the same way that like detective work, it's making its way to fruition in Zodiac. So like they literally have to take pictures of headlines or ABC logos and then in order to like superimpose them onto the live broadcast, like
the chirons, all the lettering, how that's put in.
Yeah, it's a much more tactile and like handheld endeavor than it is currently. And it does feel like a bygone era in a lot of ways. And I think that the details of that certainly show it, but it's also a bygone era just in terms of the way it's portrayed. It's like if you think about the way that our parents talk about the news media, it's like they trusted Walter Cronkite. The media was a way of telling them the truth, which is now like, can you find anyone in the world that has anything positive to say about the media? So it's just a very, very different age that we're looking at in this film.
I completely agree. And that's a point I'm going to put a pin in because I want to come come back to that a little bit later. For now, I will talk a little bit about the acting. So we have Peter Sarsgaard, John Magaro, and Leonie Benesch, which I all think did a really great job in the film, but I can't really single them out individually in terms of their performance or explain them in various ways, because as you said, we don't get really too deep into these characters. They're really just more of an acting ensemble. That's actually one of the things I liked about the film. I thought the acting was extremely natural. Everyone really fits into this very stylistic time period as a unit. This is something that I thought was really cool because running a studio is almost like a family affair, and everybody has their little role to play within it. And whether it's reporting a scene from the outside, the lady that's putting all the Chiron letterings together, somebody's doing audio. So there's this very family type atmosphere to this situation. So I liked that these characters don't really stand out from each other too much. There's not like a sole performance that like takes over the movie. Of course, John Magaro is probably the most prominent figure in the movie, but I just really like that all these characters play as more of a family unit rather individualistically.
That's a really interesting idea because that's actually a criticism of I see of the film. Although I do agree with you that in some ways, I wouldn't want the film to give up its momentum, because one of the best parts about it is minute to minute, you don't know what's going to happen and you're on the edge of your seat. So stopping to give like a tragic backstory to a character is not a great idea. But at the same time, I think there are ways they could have integrated this to be a bit better. For instance, instead of deep individual characterization, you kind of said yourself that you can't separate the actors' performances that much. I find that the actors and the characters are more there to service the film's themes rather than be multidimensional characters within themselves. Like, we have these archetypes of the dedicated journalist, we have this like righteous truth seeker, we have a cynical but ultimately like good-hearted editor who wants the right thing, and determined field reporters who are like very, very intent on getting the story no matter what. And these characters function less as fleshed out individuals than they do as ideas about journalism in general and the film's thematic concerns. So it is also somewhat of like a natural hazard of the runtime of the film. I suppose like we just don't have time for that. And at the same time, I'm not sure that the film has time to engage with complexity, but I wish that there was some way somehow of integrating just a little bit more character detail into the film.
To clarify, I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I completely understand where you're coming from, and I agree with you. What I was referring to is just like the way the characters work as like a family unit.
Yeah.
It's very basic, but that's what I liked about it. But going into something that you had mentioned earlier, there is this real urgency to every scene that really does make sense, because tragedies such as this one moved in such a flurry of events until their devastating conclusions. This script perfectly matches this urgency, moving from scene to scene with such purpose and intention. The character dialogue just spills over each other and into each scene congruently. You never really feel like you're provided with a moment to just like chill out and breathe. Totally. This movie just keeps moving. But also, as we were talking about earlier, there are some negatives to this whole viewpoint of following this news crew. And I think that lies in the film's inability to dig deeper into its own moral questions. There's this particular moment in the film where this question arises about whether an act of terror happens on the screen and whether to show it knowing that one of the victim's family members might be watching this live. I think these moral questions surrounding journalistic integrity are super interesting, yet as quickly as we jump into these questions, the film just as quickly jumps out of them. And I think engaging with these questions are super important, because the film is not really a film about the tragedy itself. It's more about how the tragedy is covered. So it made complete sense in this film to dive into these moral complexities and questions. I feel like there was a bit of a missed opportunity here to dive a little bit deeper into these questions and this journalistic integrity, especially in a current world that is so plagued by opinion panels and all this misinformation. And that goes a little bit into what you were saying earlier about how nobody trusts the news anymore.
Yeah.
I think it's more of a question about being critical rather than just denouncing the entirety of journalism, but that's just my own opinion. But that being said, I do like that the film at least engaged with these, even slightly, these issues. I just wish it had done it a little bit more.
Yeah, I agree with you. I give it credit for engaging with it at all, but it does bother me that it disposes of those questions so readily. I think it goes hand in hand with what you were talking about, but in a similar scene, and maybe even the same scene, it was talking about how their like coverage, their live coverage of the terrorist attack and terrorist hostage taking, does that play into the terrorist hands? Are they actually doing more to aid terrorism than they are report to the people? And I found that how quickly they dismissed that question of like, we have to tell the truth, to be like, very unexamined. I think that's such a complex issue that it was worthy of a little debate. Could have been actually really helpful to the film, because in some ways where people stood and in what parts of that debate they would feel would give a lot of color to their characters. So it would do two things at once. It would make the film more interesting on a thematic and emotionally complex level, but it would also give us an indication of where these characters stand and give us character dynamics that will echo throughout the film. So I think it was a real missed opportunity for like a further layer of drama in a complex situation.
So you ready to go to grades?
Yes, I'm going to give September 5 a B. I thought it was a good film. I thought it was really enjoyable when I was watching it. Again, I have some issues with not necessarily its ethics, but how it engages with its subject matter. I think it could have been a lot more complicated and a lot more interesting. I know that we mentioned Munich earlier. That's a Spielberg film that takes a much more epic scope to the same events, basically, and it's not from a journalistic angle, and it's a very different film, but in some ways it feels like the definitive statement on these events, and it's full of ambiguity and questions about the justification of violence and like what is really worthy, or like the ultimate effect of government sanctioned violence and revenge. Like, it's a tremendous film, and I think it's something that engages with this event with a tremendous amount of moral complexity that is just absent here. And again, I know that this film is about journalism. It's not necessarily about these events, but there are some really interesting moral questions here that I wish that the film had talked about a little bit more deeply. And I think it knew it needed to do that, and that's why it had such like a cursory understanding of those ideas. But yeah, I think that's crucially missing here. And I don't think that that's something that, Geoff Brain just needs in a movie. I think it's a film that was almost begging you to ask the question, and then the fact that it gave you such a poor answer is not great in my opinion. But there's so much worth liking here. I mean, I think the script is pretty good. I think the acting is really tremendous, especially John Magaro and Peter Sarsgaard. And it was a good watch. It was a movie that I would easily watch again. It just fell a little short.
I completely agree. I also give the film a B as well. I think it was a very propulsive watch, as a word you used earlier, that showcased this terrible attack on innocent people in a very sensitive time in history. However, I wish that sensitivity and this weight was engaged with a bit more, as you were saying, and as we said multiple times in this review. The thing is, the movie makes a point to bring up these issues. So, like, why bother bringing up the issues unless you know they're important to just abandon them? So,
yeah, I'm not, like, forcing it on the movie.
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
kinda there.
The movie is making a point to bring them up. So the movie is begging you to engage with that idea, but the movie is not engaging with it itself. I do see why this got a screenplay nomination. I think the script is extremely tight, extremely propulsive. It's so fast moving. There's a lot of great natural dialogue. But I agree with you. I think just in the current climate of traditional media, there could have been such a big statement or point here about maybe the way media has changed over the years, or how we criticize or engage with traditional media. There could have been a lot that this movie could have been. I just see it there. And the movie's asking some of those questions, so I just wish it went deeper into that. All right, and that's it for our review of September 5. September 5 is now streaming on VOD, so if you haven't seen it, go check it out. Let us know in the comments, what did you think about this film? As always, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.